This podcast is a member of the Place to Be Nation family. Visit us at placetobenation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.
Hey everybody, welcome to a special PTBN Play episode on the PTBN Pop feed. My name is Brad Woodling. I'm joined by Jordan Duncan tonight. Jordan, how are you?
I'm doing great. This is the fastest introduction of a podcast of all time, I think.
This is how we differentiate ourselves. We get right to the business. You know,
Right.
Some people like to have very long intro songs and then long drawn-out opens. You're going to read the description and we're going to jump right into it, guys. So as a quick refresher, in case you're listening to this 40 years from now, if nuclear war didn't destroy our planet, PTBN Play is anything video gaming, tabletop gaming, any gaming at all, anything under that umbrella on our pop feed. So what Jordan and I are going to do is we're going to be beginning a long series here tonight, and it plays off of the recent hashtag GameStruck4, which sounds weird, and it looks weird too, but essentially what it was something on Twitter, and for me, I think I saw Kenny Omega do it first, and so it was where people were posting four screenshots of 4 video games that kind of defined them or were very memorable for them. You know, certain pieces of these stories really connected with them, and it spanned their entire kind of life in gaming. So we really like this idea.
Is that what you mean by defined?
So we like the idea of it can mean something different to everyone, and so we like this idea. But I tell you what, it's pretty hard when you've been involved in gaming. And Jordan and I were the same age, so we were born in 1979. So that's a long string of being in gaming. It's hard to find 4, right? So what we're going to do is we wanted to go back to our very first console gaming, and that's the Atari 2600. So we're going to start there. We're going to talk about 4 games that were memorable to us, and it could be a mix of our favorites and some of the top games. We'll see what happens, and then from there we're going to work our way chronologically through, and so you can guess some of the big systems that are going to come, and we'll talk about that as we work our way through. So Jordan, let me start first by again welcoming you, and why don't you give us a quick little background about your earliest memories of the Atari 2600?
Gosh, my just legitimate straight up memories, as far back as I can remember, involve video games. So, my oldest memories are playing Atari in the basement. I remember there was some sort of video game magazine back in the day, because you could take pictures of your high scores in front of your television and mail them in, and if you got a high score, they would put you in the magazine. I remember me and my brother making our parents take pictures of our Pitfall scores and our Pac-Man scores.
Oh, that's awesome.
Very proud. But the funny thing is, I probably would have been 5 years old, so they wouldn't have been very good scores, and I don't think we ever made the magazine. But those pictures are still floating around my mom's house somewhere, in front of one of those old giant box TVs that are in the big wooden frame with handles that open to nothing.
I mean, it totally plays into the wood grain Atari 2600. I'm guessing you probably had a similar version to that.
We sure did.
Yeah.
We did have the sleeker one, too. We ended up with the sleeker, just almost looks like a PlayStation Slim, if you remember that one. It's just solid black.
Yeah, is that the one they called the Vader console? Did they come out around? Sure. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. They and then they had, you could have, with Atari then, the 5200 and 7800, they played 2600 games, and they had all kinds of different things, too, with it. But that's cool.
It's weird, though, because Atari's, obviously my oldest game memories are Atari, but they're not really the fondest memories. Not that I didn't like them, but I think my fondest memories start with the Nintendo. Atari's kind of, that starter thing. And I feel like it's maybe because of the graphics, but is it similar for you where Atari just doesn't age well?
Yeah, it doesn't. It's hard to be. So we're playing off some very early childhood nostalgia, where it's more of our first memories versus this is good. I remember I really liked the Nintendo because you had 2 buttons, and the Commodore 64 used an Atari joystick, and the Atari, so it's 1 button,
right?
And It's interesting, actually, because there were some Atari games that used both controllers. I'm going to talk about one a little later, because they were kind of envisioning like moving to that 2-button that we were so familiar with. And so, that was my earliest. I wouldn't say they were great memories. So we had at my grandparents' house up in the Poconos. So it was probably my first video game memory. It waffles between that, and I remember going to my uncle's house and seeing like my older cousin. He was probably like maybe like 8 or 9 years older than me, and they were playing I think Irving versus Bird on like the Commodore 64.
Yeah.
And I remember being like, whoa, like this is amazing, because I was like totally into sports. And so, and then we had the 2600, which was at my grandparents' house. And so that was, I remember sitting by myself and playing a lot of these games, or I'd like rope my younger sister in to play with me, because Atari games are essentially 2-player, except for some of this we may talk to. So I remember roping her into playing with me too. But I don't ever go back, and as much as I've been a little bit of a retro game collector, and I have a 2600 still today. It's not the original one that I played on, same model,
sure.
And but I do not regularly fire it up or anything like that, but I do have a small collection of games that were meaningful to me. So I think as we'll get on to, from a meaningful standpoint, we'll get into that with like the Nintendo and things like that. But
Absolutely.
so Atari is kind of the same kind of start for me as you there.
It's like you get your toes in the water, but when you learn how to swim, you're swimming with Mario.
That's right. And then you go, what was I doing with these really terrible graphics though?
Well, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, for Christmas, when my wife got me, they came out with some Atari classics for PlayStation 4.
Yeah.
If there's anyone listening and thinking, oh, maybe I should get that, don't buy that. First of all, there's 2 volumes, $20 each. That's a ripoff, because I guarantee every Atari game that was ever released could be fit onto one disc. And it's if you're thinking back with fond memories, don't bother them. Just let them stay fond. I fired that up. I'm like, oh, this. One game that I played was Haunted House. I don't know if that's on your list. It's not on mine. I remember loving it as a kid, and I played it like a year ago, and I had no idea what I was doing, why I ever enjoyed it, or what was wrong with me as a child. So,
well, I would get to the games like that, standalone adventure type things don't hold up quite so well.
Sure.
I think that they would probably argue that like the wrapper that they built around like the high scores and like the online leaderboards and stuff for that could maybe warrant 2 volumes. I have actually myself not dove in on those 2 collections. And I think maybe at the end we'll talk a little bit on how you can play Atari games if you do wish to today. They're actually, very small and probably the easiest emulated games out there. So quite a few options, but those 2 are definitely the current gen ones that you'll see at Target sitting there for $19.99. And it'll cross your mind. I mean, that's why they're priced like that.
Right.
It's really like an impulse price point,
I'm sure that's what they were. Impulse. Oh, he likes the old games, because this is when the NES Classic was out, so not this past Christmas, but the Christmas before. She couldn't buy me that, so she got me Atari, and our marriage nearly ended, Brad.
Have you forgiven her yet? No.
Well, I have, because she got me the Super Nintendo Classic last year, so she redeemed herself.
Very good. Mm-hmm. So let's move into our 4, and Jordan, I'm going to let you go first.
Okay, sure. Well, just a little caveat. I specifically avoided listing games to where I have a better memory of playing them at actual arcades or like pizza parlors and things like that. So like Dig Dug, Donkey Kong, Pac-Man, Frogger, all good Atari games, but I remember pumping quarters into machines and playing those even better. So I didn't leave any of those out, or I didn't put any of those on my list. Number 4, I'm going to start with, you mentioned how some Atari games were 2 players. This one was actually a 4-player game. And you didn't use the regular joystick, you used the paddle, which that was another thing about Atari. Some games required the paddle. And I went with this one for my first entry because since I know a lot of our listeners are wrestling fans, I figured if their interest is starting to wane, I could mention this name because I picked the game Warlords. As in the Warlord from WWF. Are you familiar with Warlords?
I am not.
Okay, so Warlords was a simple paddle game. Most of the paddle games were basically shoot a ball, try and break a wall. Super Breakout, Atari Circus, things like that. Warlords was up to 4 players, and you each got a corner, and you had a wall built. Supposed to be a castle. And so you'd shoot the ball, and you had a paddle that kind of went around each corner. and as you hit the walls, you would break down the walls, and you were trying to kill the person inside of each castle, each warlord. So it's kind of a 4-player game where you're. It was different than your standard Breakout, where your paddles are sliding across the bottom of the screen, because there's 4 paddles. Yeah. So bottom left, bottom right, top right corners. It's just a really unique game, and I remember playing that with friends, and it was the only 4-player game I remember. We played a lot of Warlords, and it was a game for me as a kid who's 5 or 6 years old, just furiously moving that paddle back and forth. I couldn't beat my big brother. I could beat my dad or my mom sometimes. I wouldn't always do it, but it was a game where really anyone had a shot at winning. It was a really fun game. So Warlords is my first pick as an Atari game that sticks out to me as a defining game for the 2600.
Okay. Awesome. Hold on one second here.
I'm surprised you didn't know the Warlords, man. That's a pretty good one.
Well, I think also is that we are, we're kind of, we were at an age where we were 5 or 6 where we weren't exactly shopping or collecting, so we're kind of limited to like what did we have in the house. And there were a lot of 2600 games, right? So I'm going to do a quick segue in that, back then they didn't have the same laws or kind of like a licensing that they have today, right? Where like only Nintendo could make Nintendo games, right? And remember Tengen sued them and whatnot because they would make third-party games. Well, when the Atari was going on, like anybody, Sears can make them. Anybody can make a game that played on the Atari 2600. And heck, I'm trying to remember the system. It was either the ColecoVision or the Intellivision. Something in there like could actually play 2600 carts. Oh, wow. And that was when they kind of drew the line and like started being like, no, you can't make hardware that can play our games. So yeah, it was the Wild West, and that's partially where the video game collapse of 1983 came in. Yes. Now we were still playing these games because our grandparents or parents had bought them, and they were like, you're going to play them, and they paid a lot, and they were probably bad, as we may discuss later too. A lot of bad games, And actually, another funny story is, we talked about hinting. We're going to talk about the NES next. Is that the original NES games have sprite art on the front, right? You think of like Super Mario Brothers, and the reason they did that, and I will cite this in a story in a second for those out here that may have saw it, was that Atari got there were a lot of issues around the crash because Atari's box art was amazing. So people would buy these games and be like, wow, look at this Warlord art. This is amazing. And then they'd open it up and be like, this looks like a penis walking around. And so the Nintendo wanted to be like, this is exactly what you get. They have, the sprite on the front, the big sprite, and then on the back they would have screenshots. And that's why they did that, because they didn't want to mislead anyone because they were trying to break into the market. And there's actually, Kotaku has a series out on YouTube with Chris Kohler, who actually I've followed for quite some time, and they're kind of reviewing, like, it's called like Complete in Box, and they're reviewing kind of early Nintendo games and different games and what came in the original packaging, and that was one of the first ones. So that's why. So Atari games, again, they looked really great. Your grandmother bought E.T. for you, and then you were pissed. So that's how it kind of went back there. So no Warlord for me. But the first one that I'm going to talk about actually is Breakout. Oh, okay. And so talk about paddles, and Breakout it's a Pong type of Pong game, right? So Pong was, the first video game, right? But those kind of physics was something that the Atari did really well. Yes. Here comes the ball. You're moving left to right real fast. You're spinning. You've probably played it on a TI calculator at one time. There have been plenty of other Breakout clone games. I actually really like those type of games, in that I will like seek them out on like the Nintendo DS, and actually on my phone right now, I kind of have like an Arkanoid.
I was going to say Nintendo had Arkanoid, which was another great game.
Yep. Arkanoid was very much a Breakout-inspired game, and actually Breakout and Super Breakout were two of the games I actually have the cartridge for, and I can say that I did have played them, and I really like the game. I like the, you're trying to get around the corner so you can get it up top, and the ball goes crazy and your score goes up, and it has a pretty defined progression in the game that you clear it, and the new screen comes up. You have a certain amount of lives, and so that was probably my earliest memory, and certainly maybe my favorite non-sports game on the Atari 2600.
Yeah, and what's cool about the Breakout and the paddle games is especially for us as we were very young, you didn't really have to have those fine motor skills yet, because you're just twisting a paddle, and sometimes you wouldn't even have to press the button either. There's a lot of good paddle games. Kaboom was another pretty good one where you just had to catch the bombs as they were dropping. But yeah, a lot of good paddle games for the Atari.
Yeah. All right, what was your next one there?
So my next one, I almost didn't rank, and I ended up putting it on there because I don't really remember the game as much as I remember a story surrounding the game. But I guess since we're listing games that defined us, if I always think of this story and I always think of this moment growing up, then that's kind of a defining moment, right? So
Sure.
I listed a game called Kangaroo. Now, Kangaroo was an interesting game. It was sort of a Donkey Kong style where, you have to climb and ascend to the top of the board to save the Joey, I guess. Is that a baby kangaroo, a Joey?
That is. Now we're an animal podcast.
Yeah,
You're learning
right.
tonight, guys.
Exactly. So you play the role of a mother kangaroo, and you have to rescue your Joey. And it was a fun game. I remember playing this one with my brother. A lot of my Atari games played with my brother. It wasn't until Nintendo where we really started to fight over who got to play what. With
Sure.
Very co-op, What was cool about Kangaroo was the kangaroo had boxing gloves, so if there's enemies, you could punch them, and that's what you would use the big red button for, was to punch rather than to jump. So to jump, you'd actually press up on the joystick. But it's basically kind of a Donkey Kong ripoff, but the whole reason I ranked it is because, now if there's any children listening, you may want to pause the podcast, have them leave the room for a few minutes or anything like that. But Kangaroo almost ruined Christmas for me, in the sense that I almost learned the truth about Santa Claus, and how it was my parents and things like that, at a very young age, because on Christmas Eve, we had gone to bed. My parents were getting the toys out and doing things. Now, when Santa came in my house, presents weren't wrapped from Santa. They were just under the tree, so we just had them. As we've grown, when Santa visits my house now, the presents get wrapped, because,
I can respect not doing that hustle.
Yeah.
The night before.
Exactly, But apparently, this year, my dad was interested in some of the games that we were getting, and he wanted to try them out before, we hogged them all up on Christmas morning. And so he busted Kangaroo out of the box, and he was playing it a little bit. And as the story goes, I don't really even remember the story, but it's been retold so much that I have this image in my head because I can picture my basement and everything. Apparently, he didn't turn the volume down enough. It woke me up. I got out of bed, started coming downstairs. My parents heard me. My dad hurried to turn off the television. They're like, "What are you doing?" They had to cover up the tree. And my words were, "I thought I heard kangaroo." And, and that's for that reason alone, I have to rank that game. That I heard Kangaroo on Christmas Eve calling to me, woke up, and nearly found out the horrifying truth that my mom and dad were the ones behind all this Santa Claus business. The game itself was fine. Like I said earlier, a lot of the Atari games don't age that well. I haven't played it in a long time because it's not really a well-known game. It's probably not going to be on any best of discs that you can buy for PlayStation or anything, but for that reason and that story alone, it's got a never-ending legacy in my family, as we've told that story for a long, long time. So Kangaroo is my number 3.
Now, I have to ask the follow-up question here is, so did you know, the sound effects from, playing it at a friend's? Because, I'm going to be honest, people, there was no voice synthesizing saying, kangaroo, or, you thought you heard him say the name.
I think what it was is that it's probably the game that I wanted most, so I just heard a game being played. Would be my guess. I honestly don't remember that much. It probably was an arcade game, because so many Atari games were just arcade ports, so maybe I'd played it in an arcade. Although arcade sounds compared to the Atari sounds probably weren't quite as spectacular, but either way, I thought I heard it, and I was right.
You were right. You were. That's a great story.
Yeah.
And pretty good ears too. I can't imagine your dad had it that loud where you were. But
right. So
I can respect him wanting to play them before his two sons hogged it for the next, because that's what
knew on Christmas morning he wasn't going to get to play those games. So
right.
But
So my next one is so I have heard of Kangaroo. I don't think I've played it, but I definitely know that the name.
Okay.
So my next one would be Frogs and Flies.
Ooh.
Have you heard of this game at all?
No.
So this is maybe my first kind of multiplayer scoreboard, like head-to-head game. Now again, all Atari games were two-player for the most part, but this game was really straightforward. It was two lily pads, you pressed up to jump, and you pressed the button to stick your tongue out, and like it was a timed game, and you tried to eat as many flies as you could in the 2 minutes or whatever, and that was your score, and then the game was over. And I only think there were two modes, and remember on Atari you could flip the game mode flicker on that would change
metal,
the game slightly. Yeah. That was essentially your new game plus and your different options you had to change. And that was done in some games, and I'm going to talk about one in a little bit. But for that one, there were only two modes, right? And so Frogs and Flies. And so I would play that against my sister a lot. And actually what was cool was that if the second player didn't pick up right away, the AI would play itself.
Okay.
So that was neat. They would kind of keep going. So you could, I could sit in front of the wood panel TV and play that, and there wasn't really any advancing anything. Essentially what it was it started at daylight, and so the timer kind of went as the day went on, and as soon as it got dark, the game was over, and that was that. But they do, and it had frog noises, I'm sure. And I remember that one very fondly for whatever reason. So,
it's funny as you were saying it. Of course, I Googled it, and looking at the images, I do remember this game. It's a memory that had long been out of my brain, but yeah, I remember playing this game. Pretty good graphics for an Atari game, actually.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, I would agree with that. And it wasn't too challenging because it was pretty static, right? Yeah. So, but yeah, that's cool. Yeah, and there's so many games where it's like you just can't remember the name too. Mm-hmm. And I've struggled with some of those when I come up with my list too, that I've tried for years to kind of remember. But that's cool that a little kernel was in your brain. You haven't thought about that in 30 years. So
I must not have been good at it. Otherwise, I would proudly boast about how many flies.
I don't think it had a lot of replay value.
Yeah,
so
probably not.
So. But
so, all right,
what's your
both our number threes are of the Animal Kingdom. Great. All right.
Yes.
So my number two is probably the game that I played most for Atari. Not necessarily because I liked it the most, but years after the Atari was long gone, Nintendo, maybe even into Super Nintendo years, we would go down to Georgia every summer for family vacation. My uncle had a house on the lake, and we'd stay at the lake for, a week and swim and all this stuff. And there was TVs and things like that. But the only video game system was an Atari 2600. So to get our video game fix, we would play the Atari 2600. He only had about 5 games. But this is a game that I had even at our home, and just because we played it so much at vacation. I actually ranked Superman number 2. Have you ever played Superman?
Very nice. I have. I did not play. We did not have it, but I am familiar with that game. I've seen some different reviews and stuff on it.
Yeah, it's a real fun game. Basically, the game starts. It's a simple game. There's a simple finish to it. It doesn't take that long. It's really about how fast you can get it done. But the game starts, and Lex Luthor and all kinds of bad guys break out of jail. You're Clark Kent, so you got to find a phone booth, turn into Superman, and then you just fly around, fly into buildings, fly up and down through Metropolis, and try and find, Lex Luthor, and you'd scoop him up and fly him to jail, avoid the kryptonite. Pretty simple thing. There's only one, I wouldn't even say levels, because it was the same thing over and over. It's just trying to master it and get it done as quick as possible, because there was a timer. I don't know that there was a score so much as it was a timer, and whoever could get it done the fastest, of course, would win. But I played Superman. I liked it a lot. We played it at home, too, and we had Spider-Man as well. Spider-Man was another really good game.
That was a good game.
Yeah, where you would climb the buildings. Spider-Man was probably a better game, but because of the summer aspect, and there was only a few games to choose from, Superman got played a lot in my lifetime, so it had to rank on my list.
Very good. That's a great pick.
Thanks. How about you?
So, I think for my number 2, so I'm going to go with, so I talked a little bit about kind of single player games. And kind of towards the end of Atari, they were trying to move to this, right? And there's, I think, maybe a game on your list, one you name dropped already, that was maybe one of the original side scrollers. But so I talked about E.T., right? Where it was like grandmothers got burned because this very popular movie. You can look the story up. You can look the story up on. Well, I'm going to actually go with E.T. here, and also it's going to be a hybrid. So I'm going to cheat because of defining, right? Like
that's true.
I'm going to put E.T./Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I'm going to talk about, because these games were trying to be ambitious single player games on the 2600 hardware, and the graphics were not good, and the games were very hard to follow, especially when you were like 6, 7, 8, 6, 7, 8, like we were, right? And so these games would, they would be. We've talked about how most of the games are, okay, so there's a clock, or there's, it's a head to head or something like that. But so this was, you had to find different pieces and bring them to a certain spot. And then if you did that while avoiding these bad guys, you would then advance through or beat the game, and it would start itself over again, and things would be in a different spot. And so E.T., famously, it's not that, some people call it like the worst game ever. It's more so the biggest flop ever, because they made so many, because they paid so much money to get the license. This is, one of the first licensed games, right? They spent so much money to get the license. They had not a lot of time to put the game out, and they did it. And then, of course, it sold a lot, and then the video game crash come, and people were burned because the game was not what they expected, and they had all these leftover ones, so they buried them, and there's a documentary you can see about that.
It's a good one. It's called Game Over, right?
Yeah, I've been meaning to watch it to find it. Yeah, and so I remember they had, and again too, because this is my grandparents' house, so we had Raiders of the Lost Ark and we had E.T. And I remember sitting there trying to figure out how these games worked. And actually, Raiders used both joysticks. One joystick toggled your inventory. So one will use your inventory. That was you switching what you could use, and the other one was the move around, which is wild stuff for 1983 or whatever it was. And as a little kid, I just wasn't getting it. And it just, you look at this and be like, wow, this has to be cool. I have to figure this out. And it was just, how many times trying to get these phone pieces for ET, so the ship would come down. I don't think I ever did, because you had, actually, ET had, you could pick up health, right? But you also could take damage, and you had a declining health bar, which is kind of part of the timer. So you had a certain amount of time to get all these pieces. So it wasn't a bad game, and it certainly had a good idea to it. But for some reason, those two games there, I just remember playing those and trying to figure them out. And then again, so when Nintendo came along, it was like, oh my gosh, Mario Brothers, this is so straightforward versus this junk on the Atari.
It's very clear.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's going to be my number 2 from a defining standpoint.
Yeah, I think if we rounded it out to 5, Raiders would be my number 5. I flirted with putting it on my list.
Nice. Okay, so there's your crossover.
Yeah, and what's funny about it too is, I mean, if you saw the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, it wouldn't help in any way figure out the game. I remember there was one screen where you could pick between 2 jars, and one was a poisonous viper, and you just die if you pick that one. Yeah, that was it. It's just totally random.
It's like a coin flip. Yeah, I remember that actually screen that you're talking about too. That's crazy.
Yep. And it was a good game. I mean, at least back then I thought it was a good game, because we did play it a lot, and it was a thing where I would do the inventory for my brother while he played the game and stuff like that. So, yeah, ambitious, cool. I think is a better word than good.
And I think a lot of these require you really, really following the instruction book. But again, as little kids, we weren't sitting there with that book open, trying to follow the directions. So ET was literally just trying to piece together out of the blue, how this worked.
Right. All right, you want me to give you my top?
Yeah, all right.
Okay. So my number 1 is actually, let me think of how to introduce this a little bit better. This is probably my all-time favorite Atari game. And it's a sequel. And what's funny is the original is probably on everybody's short list as one of their favorites. But I
Okay.
actually hated the original. I went with
Interesting.
Pitfall 2
Ah,
as the
okay.
number one game of all time. And I'll explain why. I was never a fan of Pitfall. And part of it, I think, is because I was the youngest in my family. And Pitfall was a game where you had a timer. I think it was like a 10, 15-minute game. And it was just about getting the high score. You know, you'd swing through the vines, you'd jump on the alligators' heads, you'd try and find treasures and things like that. And at the end of the timer, whoever had the high score won. Well, I would never have the high score. I was 5 years old, you know?
Right.
So I was never a real big fan of Pitfall. But I did like the jungle games. Atari had a lot of jungle games, by the way. They had Congo Bongo, Jungle Hunt, which was similar to Pitfall. I like those games better than Pitfall. I don't know if there's ever been a better named video game than Congo Bongo, by the way.
It's pretty good.
But Pitfall 2 came out, and Pitfall 2 had a subtitle. It was Lost Caverns. And in my mind, they fixed everything wrong with the original Pitfall because it was a game that could be defeated. It was a game that had a defined ending. Like, you can beat the game. It wasn't about beating my brother or my dad or my friends. I could just beat Pitfall. And I loved that. It had save points, if you remember that. And what was really great was, as a little kid, it was a game where you basically had unlimited lives. So you were gonna beat the game as long as you just continued playing the game. But it basically took Pitfall and just expanded it. It went from side-scrolling to also up and down scrolling, because you would go deep in the caves, and you had to find Pitfall Harry's niece. I should have Googled her name ahead of time. I don't remember it. But I do remember his lion. You had to find his pet lion, which was named Quick Claw, and he was terrified. You'd see him right at the start of the game. He's just sitting there shaking. And you also had to find a giant diamond ring for some reason. You could not beat the game until you found all three of those things. And I played that game... no exaggeration, probably played it through and beat it 250 times in
Wow.
the span of a year and a
That was all we had, people.
Yeah.
There was not a...
It was either Pitfall 2 or Venture. So, but yeah, I really loved Pitfall 2. It was a game that, it was one of the first games I loved. You know, a lot of the other games, because again, I was the youngest, we would play the games that other people in the family picked, and I'd just play if I could. But that was the first game that was my game that I loved, and I was pretty good at it. I loved Pitfall 2. It was probably my favorite Atari game of all time.
Yeah, and so this is a great pick. I've not played it, but so some facts on it, and I've read about this game before. So David Crane did it. He's one of the better designers on the Atari, and with it, we all know the name. So here's something younger listeners can relate to: Activision, right? Mm-hmm. So they were a huge developer and publisher on the 2600, and in fact, their carts and the art on the carts kind of all look the same. You could tell, so Activision was developing, and they were printing these carts themselves too, and they were the best developer for this game. And there was actually even a compilation for PS2 and I think PSP. Yeah, definitely PSP. This is Activision classics, and it's their 2600 games, and these are the better games on the system you're going to find. Yes. And Pitfall 2 was one of the last releases on the 2600, so this is after that crash we talked about. So it really was like, let's say you're programming a game for the Nintendo right now, and he just absolutely maximized what the system could do. Right. And that was and so that was Pitfall 2, and it's actually that's a great pick, and I think you're, I would say, lucky to have it, but I don't run across too many people that had that one, just because, again, people were either turned off by it at that point by the Atari, because this was 1984. It was late in the game, yeah. Yeah, in 84, so the Nintendo wasn't quite out yet, but it was close, so 85 for Nintendo.
I believe you could swim in Pitfall 2 as well. Which was a pretty unique thing, that, it wasn't just running and jumping. There was also swimming. Just the aspect of doing multiple different things is pretty ambitious for an Atari game.
the game's plot, and now we're on Wikipedia, which is not all too unfamiliar. It was loosely remade into Super Pitfall on the NES, so there you go.
Yeah, and there was a Super Nintendo Pitfall game that was actually really good too. I'm not sure what that was called, but I remember on the Super Nintendo Pitfall game, you could access a hidden level and play the original, not the game I'm talking about, but the original Pitfall, like the 2600 graphics, along with the sounds and everything. So Pitfall's definitely one where the sounds still ring in my head, from Atari. music was not really one of Atari's strong points, but the sound effects of Pitfall might be most famous to me.
And one other note on there, and I knew this is where I read it from, right? So there was a time 6 years ago or so where I would get the Retro Gamer magazine. It's a UK published, but you could get it in Barnes & Noble here. Really high quality, like $8-9 a magazine. Really nice art and stuff. And they had a 2600 issue, and I have it upstairs in my office now.
Awesome.
And this game, and Pitfall 2, The Lost Caverns, was ranked the number one 2600 game of all time.
So
you're talking, you got it right. And so that's where I remember it from. So when you brought up, like, God, I haven't played this game, but God, I know so much about it. Why? Oh, because I read this gigantic article on it 7 years ago. So there you go.
All right. Well, I guess I have excellent taste then. So
there you go.
Since I picked the best game, I guess your choice is just going to be subpar. But let's hear what it is, anyways.
Well, we're gonna morph into some sports game talk now. So when we started doing our Game Struck 4, we were all talking about sports games that defined the '90s for us in our PTBN chat. Because again, you're talking about a demographic that is guys loosely within the same 10 years of age and likes wrestling, likes sports for the most part. So we've all played this game. So the first sports game that I ever played was Super Challenge Baseball for the Atari 2600. And now, so Super Challenge Baseball was one of those Sears games I talked about. Really thin black carts that had a sloped, angled front.
Yep, I know exactly.
And blue letters. And they also had Super Challenge Football. Look, these were not fancy-looking games, right? And I guarantee I'm almost positive they were Sears purchases. They developed them or whatever. And my grandparents had these games. And again, I was super into sports. Anything I could watch and consume, I would. We played outside all the time, and so they had baseball, and the only thing was, I really didn't have anybody to play against in baseball, so I play against myself. So with two controllers in front of me, this is where I learned my hand-eye coordination. Is I would pitch with one,
oh wow,
and then immediately grab the other controller and hit with the other, and then immediately go back and field with the other controller. And I remember my uncles and my dad, when my dad's brothers and brother-in-law, sitting, we're in this family room, and they're nobody wanted to play me. I guess I was good at it. Maybe they were just being nice or tired adults, as we know now. It's oh no, you're too good, I don't want to play. At the time I was yeah man, look, I'm so good, my uncles don't even want to play me. But now as a dad, I'm yeah, they were just wanted to get 15 minutes of everyone shutting up. Yeah. So I really remember this baseball game and sitting around, and that's my most defining memory is the extended family sitting around as this child sits in the middle of this floor with this orange fluffy carpet,
Just like my basement. Yep.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, this is the 80s, baby. So, and then football too, real quick on it too. That was another one we had, but that was super confusing. And literally just a couple years ago, before my grandfather passed, I was up at the house, and underneath a pile of VHS tapes of old minor league baseball year in review things, I found our crisp original Atari manuals that we had never opened, right? Never done it. The games in the system were long gone. My younger cousin had it or whatever, and I no interest again, because I wasn't I want to play the Atari again. No, I did not. Then as a nostalgia hunter, I was I just want to see what's still in here, and I found all these manuals. Some of the games I'd never played, so who knows where they were. But I remember finding football, and I would sit and try to figure this game out, and it was so confusing to try to, you just hike and you could run off the left side of the screen, you show up on the other, and it was just, I tried to make my siblings play, and they were just this game sucks. And so, but baseball was my main one, but I remember the football counterpart, and actually, a couple years ago, I think I spent $1.50 maybe, or $2, and I procured a copy of each of those that I have on my shelf.
What's funny,
purely
I went to Amazon to see if you could buy a copy of Super Challenge Baseball, and $3.76. So you got it for a steal if you only paid.
Yeah, I think that's probably they're overcharging and inflating there on that one. That's a dollar bin game.
I will say this though, it has a 5-star review. It's the only review for the entire game. And here's what Owen Clampett reviewed.
Okay, what did he say? I like this guy already.
He said, "Good game, plays great."
Okay,
so
he
even still
in 2005 or whenever he put that review out. Good game, plays great. I mean, I guess it did. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
but that
offense and defense at the same time. So yeah, it must be.
yeah. Yeah, it was good. I remember hitting home runs, and that's why, as we segue into what it'll be with the NES, is that some of those games and some of those sports games were so, mind blowing. I remember going to youth events at our church and being like, "Oh, Andy brought his Nintendo and Tecmo Bowl," and I was like, what is this?"
Yeah, we could just rank the sports games for NES.
We'll get to that. That was just a minor teaser for the end, but those are my Atari picks there. And you talked a little bit about the current gen ones, and if you wanted to find those. And something else I wanted to mention, if you mentioned the NES Mini, is in addition to the software that comes for like the PS4 and stuff, is they do have kind of the flashback consoles for Atari,
yes,
where it's the plug and play, and those are actually very good. So a lot of plug and play consoles are not good, like any Sega clones. They're bad.
Yes.
But with Atari, the sound sucks already, and the emulation has been perfected because it was not anything to write home about.
Right.
So those consoles are actually very diverse. You can use your original controllers with them.
Wow.
Too, if you wanted to put them in, and they have some cool things like I can't remember the names of that, but there's some unreleased games, like some sequels that never got published that they put on those consoles and stuff. So if you were an Atari aficionado, you already know this. But those ones I would say is they're actually good machines to capture like that Atari feel if you needed to have that plugged into your current day TV.
Yeah, and
there are plenty of options.
You can pick those up like I've seen them at Target and Walmart and Toys R Us while they're still around. You could pick those up as well. So
yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, Atari is
that's our first one.
Yeah, we made it through the first one. Atari is not my fondest system, but it is it was my gateway system, and so for that, I will always cherish some Atari memories. But as we progress, I've got more memories, and the ensuing lists that we make are going to be a lot harder to come up with, to narrow down to 4. Especially when we get into those defining childhood years, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and even really the more recent years of current gen systems, I think is going to be kind of tough as well. So,
sure. So, hey, if you have any memories from the 2600, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook or Twitter. Share them with Jordan and I, and we will be happy to converse with you on that one.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you're wondering where we got this again, the hashtag that you can look up on Twitter, I think on Facebook as well, but Twitter is where we found is hashtag GameStruck4, the number 4. I believe it was Barstool Gaming was the original account that came up with it. But if you want to just share it so we see it, you can use the hashtag PTB Top 4, and we'll be using that for all of our episodes so we can kind of keep track of who likes what, and we'll go ahead and probably post our lists tonight or tomorrow whenever this pod drops. How's that sound, Brad?
Yeah, it sounds good, and I think I may even pull like 4 images from my games and post them out there so people go, what?
Yeah.
Right? So we can share those around too so you can see what we're talking
I'll
about.
just put a picture of Santa Claus for my kangaroo entries.
That's a great story. I'm going to look up kangaroo. That's the first thing I'm going to look up for the Atari after this. I want to see what this game was. So
not bad. It was okay. The story is why it made the list, not the game itself. So
sure. I will say just one other. My one cut was Combat. I don't know if you're familiar with Combat. It was like the first game, like 1977 on the system, and I have a family story with that too. So my brother was cleaning out his grandfather-in-law's house after he passed away, and he had a pretty fresh 2600 with like some of the controllers I don't think were ever used. So it's amazing to find like these from 1980 that are like brand new. And he had brought it down to my parents' house, and we had plugged it in on like a really small TV to see like if it worked, and it did. And we put Combat in, and so then I have a couple pictures from years ago, of my very young niece and nephews like sitting there with a controller in their hand playing Combat, which was driving tanks around and shooting bullets that could bounce off walls. And actually with that game, we talked about the game select. You could flip to biplanes and invisible tank. It had like 27 different options, and this was one of the first games for the system.
And one of the best.
So it was really close to making my list, but I really wanted to talk about sports, and because I actually don't remember playing that too much younger, but my dad did. Like he knew, oh, I know this game, so he must have long before me, or not long before me, but around when I was way too young to remember. So
Excellent.
So that is that. Again, thank you, everybody. Jordan, thank you for joining me. Nice, and we'll talk again real soon.
All right, sounds good. Take care.
Take care.
Promotional consideration paid for by the following.
Hey, pro wrestling announcer Kevin Kelly here. I want to make sure you are all subscribed to all the great feeds here at Place to Be Nation. It's really easy to do. Just head to iTunes or your preferred podcatcher app today and search and subscribe to the Place to Be Nation wrestling feed, which of course includes the full archives of the Kevin Kelly Show, the Place to Be Nation pod feed, and the Pro Wrestling Only feed. Subscribe, listen, and then rate us and leave feedback today. And be sure to give Justin your true thoughts. I mean, don't hold back. After all, he is kind of a jerk. Just listen to Scott.
Place to Be Nation's JT Rosero and Chad Campbell here. We want to let you know that we have a ton of great podcasts available to you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and PlayStation.com, and we offer those to you on 3 great feeds. On the Place to Be Nation Wrestling feed, we bring you the Mothership, the original Place to Be podcast, as well as Main Event, Lucha Afterground, and our monthly pay-per-view reaction shows, as well as the Our Vantage Point podcast and Jeff Learns Wrestling. In addition to these full-length shows, we also deliver quick-hit pod blasts on topics old and new.
Over on the Pro Wrestling Only feed, we dive deep inside the wrestling business with a stacked army of experts leading the way. The feed features potpourri shows such as This Week in Wrestling, Greetings from Allentown, Psychology is Dead, Puro Potpourri, Stacy and Elliot's Bogus Journey, and the Military Industrial Suplex. We also have shows that focus intently on certain topics like Letters from Center Stage, Space City, and NWA Classics on Demand Adventure, Through the Years, Strong Style History, Strong Style Story, and Mount Olympus. Plus, the feed has the full archives of legendary shows like Titans of Wrestling, Where the Big Boys Play, Letters from Kayfabe, and much more. And on our popular Place to Be Nation Pop podcast feed, we offer such great shows as the Glenn Butler Podcast Hour Spectacular, Rank and File, PTBN Dadcast, Go Home in a Box, NBA Team, and Lucha Undead, as well as a veritable podcast heaven for comics fans with the Hard Traveling Fanboys, Sellers Points, Todd Weber's Conversation, Geek and Sassy, and Imaginary Stories podcasts.
You can find all of these current shows plus archives of our past podcasts, including The Kevin Kelly Show, as well by subscribing to all of our feeds on iTunes, and while there, be sure to rate and leave feedback as well. All of these shows, plus others available on PlaceToBeNation.com, where we cover pro wrestling, sports, movies, comics, plus in-depth stretch projects and more. Be sure to support our site by using PlaceToBeNation.com/Amazon when shopping online, and download our free PTB Vintage Vault Refresh ebooks via the links on our site. We also want to thank our friends at Bonehead's Wing Bar in West Warwick, Rhode Island, and Fall River, Massachusetts, TheHistoryOfWrestling.com, and Scott Keats' Blog of Doom. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr as well. PlaceToBeNation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.
Place to Be Nation, it is me, the manager, Todd Weber, and I'm here to tell you all about a brand new show on the PTBN Pop feed. It's Talkin' Pop. Each month, hosts Jennifer Smith and Tim Capel discuss the hottest topics in pop culture along with their special guests. Funny, illuminating, and even sometimes a bit naughty, Talkin' Pop is our latest and greatest legendary Place to Be Nation podcast. So be sure to join Jenny and Tim every single month on Talkin' Pop, proudly part of the PTBN Pop feed on iTunes, Stitcher, and PlaceToBeNation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.